It is 10:30 in Finland and 9:30 in Denmark, and you are most welcome to today's webinar here from Hanaholmen in Helsinki, or actually in Espoo. We will be talking about the Danish parliamentary elections and the similarities and differences between elections and voting in Denmark and in Finland. Today it is 41 days since the results of the Danish parliamentary elections were clear, and Mette Frederiksen was asked to try to form a new government. This means that the negotiations have been going on for longer than ever before in Danish history. If I'm not misinformed, the last record, if you say so, was 31 days. There have been negotiations going on during all weekend between the parties that might be forming or be parts of the next government. It seems that they are getting closer than before to a result, but everything is still open. We'll get started with our discussion in just a minute, and it's time for me to present today's panelists. We have, and let's see if we can get them into the picture. We have Kasper M, Hansen, PhD, Department of the Political Science at the University of Copenhagen. I hope you can see Kasper. There you are. You are, if I may say so, Denmark's first and foremost expert on voting and elections. You're warmly welcome.
Thank you.
And we have Annukka Oksanen. Annukka is a Finnish journalist today with citizenship in both Denmark and Finland, since you have been living in Denmark already for many years. Annukka has been following politics in Finland and in Denmark very, very closely for long. And my name is Gestrin. I am today Director of Communications at the Foundation Konstsamfund here in Finland, but I have lived in Denmark for many years, and I'm also a member of the board of the Cultural Fund for Finland and Denmark. And our audience, you over there, you come from both Finland and Denmark, and if you have questions or comments to our discussion, please write them in the chat and I'll try to fit them into our discussions when appropriate. And one last thing before we start, and that's something about the names of the political parties now that we speak English here today. It's a little bit complicated, at least for those that are not very familiar with the Danish party scene. But I think we could repeat the parties that presently are continuing the discussions with Mette Frederiksen, at least now. And that's, of course, the Social Democrats, and that's Mette Frederiksen's own party. And then Venstre, in English, the Liberals, Moderaterna, the Moderates, and the De Radikale, which is the Social Liberal Alliance officially in English. And when we speak about these parties and others, it might sometimes be good to also mention their Danish name if it starts to get complicated. But now let's finally start. Kasper, I wanted to start with asking you something about the Danish political landscape. It looks very different now from what it looked like when you last did have a parliamentary election. There are many new parties and many voters that have voted differently than they did before. Could you shortly explain why all these changes has happened during the last years?
I think first of all, it's a development we have seen over election the last 10-15 years maybe. So we've seen voters are being more floating between parties. We see they're changing party more than ever. We see they are deciding very late. So we see a much more volatile electoral than we have seen ever before. And in a Nordic comparison, Denmark used to be quite stable and was actually lacking a little bit behind Finland in this aspect, where the Finns also tend to vote, change a lot, decide late. Now Denmark is catching up to Finland, and maybe even at this election, we ended up having 55% of the voters actually changing parties. That's more than half of the voters founding a new party. And I think that's definitely a record in Denmark, and I even think it will be a record compared to Finland. And one of the main reasons for this is, of course, that we have been through a situation lately where there's been a pandemic, been a lot of criticism towards the prime minister. That had caused, first, it caused a lot of voters to go to her, rally around the flag, support the prime minister, fight the enemy as the corona was. Then people got really skeptical, was critical about the openings again. Was it too strict? Was it not fast enough? Then there was this case about the minks, which is a small industry in Denmark, but very profitable. There's a lot of export money in that business. Small animals in cages where they skin and sell it basically to China, and there's a really lot of money in that. And they had to close those because they were spreading the coronavirus. It was spreading to these farms, and they were afraid they were going to mutate. And then in the end, they had to make a really quick decision, and it ended up didn't really have the legislation behind it. So basically, they were forced, or maybe not forced, but they at least in the end actually decided to kill all these mink without having the legislation. And of course, that is illegal. Mette Frederiksen has said so. Sorry about it. And then this discussion is, should there be an impeachment process? And that has been actually what triggered this whole election. That there was, the Social Liberal insisted that we needed to have some kind of investigation to this. And but they didn't call the election right away. They said, okay, we will have it within 3 months. So what happened over those 3 months was that the Social Democrats really got into their work clothes, and they were able to put through so much legislation in just 3 months' time, and that meant actually that they were able to kind of switch the whole agenda. So the election was not about the minks; it was about a lot of other things. But the Social Democrats were very good at changing their agenda, and yeah, in the end, they actually had a better election than they had previously, even though it's still a bad election for a Social Democrat in comparative aspects.
Yes, and actually we must get back to the minks a little bit, because yesterday we had some people talking about the minks because suddenly the impeachment process doesn't seem so interesting for the parties that want to be in the government than it did before. But Annukka, I have a first question for you as well, and that's something about the comparison between Finland and Denmark. If you compare how Finns and Danes relate to politics in general, what would you say? Because I think there is actually a difference in how we look at politics, especially maybe the young people.
Yes, I see a couple of differences there, actually. I want to start with a quote, because as you mentioned, I am a Danish citizen now, and I was in the citizenship party at the Christiansborg, the Danish parliament in September. The parliament invited new citizens there. And there we were there, these couple of thousands of new citizens, and Henrik Dam Christensen, who's the speaker of the Danish parliament, gave a speech. And he said, I have to read the direct quote. He said that the right to vote is one of the biggest gifts you receive when you become a Danish citizen, and Danish democracy needs you. And it became very clear that Denmark has great expectations for citizens to be active. And he also said, when we were let into the parliament and hop around there and talk to politicians and have coffee and cakes and lunch there. And he also said that this house is yours. And there I started to think that I've never ever had in Finland this feeling that the Finnish parliament is my house. So I think one of the differences is that in Denmark, people perceive more that common good is more common than in Finland. So people are more keen on taking care of the things together. And I think this you can see in voting activity, because Finns vote quite a bit less than Danes. So I think we have more tendency to think that politics is something that happens somewhere else and is something that other people should take care of. For instance, I thought it was kind of endearing in Denmark because voting activity was 84.1% now in the election, and then experts were concerned that why is it so low, and there's tendency that it's getting lower. And in Finland, it has last been over 80% in 1983. And now in this election, it was 72. So there's 12 percentage points difference in voting, which is quite big. And especially young people in Finland, they let others take care of the politics and voting. I think it's under 22-year-olds, which are typically the ones who vote for the first time. So it was under 55% who voted. And under 38-year-olds, it's under 70%. So it's getting lower by the age. Most active voters are 75-year-olds. So I think you can see a difference there. I think in Denmark, young people are a lot more active and openly active in politics. And
in
the other thing,
parties, I think.
Yes. Another thing is that, it's a long answer now, but other thing is, I think that...
May I respond to the turnout thing before you go
Yes.
on? So you're very right that turnout is high in Denmark compared to Finland, and I think, I'm not sure you're right about how people perceive the parliament as their house. I think that was more like a speech for new citizens, and I think that was
branding.
Yeah, very well done. But what is important is that how we vote, this norm of voting is very strong in Denmark, and it's been taught in primary schools. They have mock elections in primary schools, so everybody have tried to vote before today. And it has looked really bad in the sense that we have seen that young people are also withdrawing from voting in Denmark. But back in 2013, the parliament took a very lot of initiative to kind of make sure that young people should start to vote, and have been done a lot of get out the vote experiments here in Denmark, and municipalities are doing a lot to get young people out to vote. So we actually was able to increase the turnout for young people 17 points over the last few elections. So the young people are voting more than ever before. It is still true that 75-year-olds, just like in Finland, vote the most. But it's very true that there's simply 15 points differences across the age span. And I think primarily it's because of this duty, which has been so much taught by schools, labor unions, and just by the media. It's been seen as so our issue is basically that we are seeing that the newly immigrants, especially from the Middle East, don't vote, and that's actually what was pushing it. But we have had a drop now for the 3 elections in a row. We are having a declining slope, just like in Finland. Not as bad, but still the tendency is the same. So I think Denmark should be very much aware that this is happening, not just in Finland, but across the developed countries. We are seeing people are withdrawing from politics.
I have also been thinking that could it be also in Finland, partly because over 50% of people do this mail voting or vote beforehand in Finland.
Yes.
So there is not a big tradition for going, not as big as in Denmark, to go together and vote.
That is a very good point. I think you're very right about that. I think we have seen in Denmark, if you increase the absentee voting, you will actually have a decline in turnout. So the municipalities which have seen more people voting by mail, they will have lower turnout. So voting by mail is not by any means a way to get the turnout out. You should make it social, you should make it fun, you should make it as an event. And that was most Danes do, that they actually go down and vote on election day rather than voting absentee.
I think it's interesting what you just said, Kasper, about the duty to vote, because here in Finland we mostly speak about the right to vote, and there is a difference between the two words that is actually quite important. If you don't see it as your duty, but more than something that you can do because you have the opportunity, that's something completely different. Mm-hmm. Annukka, did you want to add something to the comparison?
Yes, I had another point. This is partly a cultural thing, but I think it reflects somehow. It reflects the whole society. But I think in Finland, there's more hierarchy that politics. When people get elected to the parliament, and especially when they become ministers, they somehow jump higher in hierarchy. And that you can see, for instance, in the fact that we say "di" or "teitittely" to ministers. Quite often journalists still say "di" to ministers. And I love watching Danish press conferences because they are a lot more direct, and they are like debates. They are not like that you are that you ask an official question and then you get an answer. That's really good example for me about that, that politicians are in our service, and we don't have to look in that way up to them. So I think it tells about that maybe the distance in between the so-called my life and the official life or politics is smaller in Denmark than it is in Finland. I don't know how to put this in any figures or anything, but this is my very strong perception.
I think there's another very important difference we have to highlight. So in Denmark, the electoral system means that you can either vote for a party or you can vote for a candidate. In Finland, you can only vote for a candidate. So basically what we are seeing in Denmark is only half, actually less than half this time, voted for a candidate. They voted for the party. That means that the parties are so much stronger as a unity compared to the Finnish election, where you actually can only vote for a person. And as others, that small difference is actually very important, and try to understand how campaigns are going. So Denmark, it's becoming more personalized campaigns as well, but it's still run by the party, financed by the party for a long time. Whereas in the Finnish case, it has been much more individualized. It has been actually been more modern in several cases, also because you have this very strong incentives for each candidate to do something unique. And I think coming back to why we see more majority governments and more broad government in the Finnish case, as we've seen in Denmark, I think this is actually coming back to this point that parties are strong in Denmark compared to what we see in Finland, where persons are strong, and they can do a difference if they really want to, and they can even switch to another party if they decide to do so.
I think you're right. Actually, it's very interesting that you mentioned this, because the voting percent is highest in Finland when we can vote for a president, where people can vote directly for one person, and then many people, also young ones, go to vote. But we actually have a question here on the chat that concerns the funding for the campaigns, and you touched upon that, Kasper. The question is there a difference in money spending for campaigning if you compare Finland and Denmark? So there is the difference that you just mentioned, that the people that are the candidates, they need to find their funds themselves, whereas in Denmark it's the parties that get the funding. But how about money, the sums?
I'm not sure about the sums. I can speak to the Danish case. So in Denmark, I think we see a large amount of money going directly from public funds to the parties, and that money is of course spent on very much professionalizing the campaign, hired staff, especially in the center party. Then the money will be directed towards the candidate in some way, but actually each candidate will also spend money of their own, maybe something like 10,000 euros or something like that they will spend to get into buying election posters, buying time on social medias, etc. So this time, the real change we saw in the Danish campaign this time was because of the social media has opened up for boosting micro-targeting on Facebook and Instagram, etc. WhatsApp. You can have a look into how they do this, and they spent 20 million just on Facebook alone. Danish crowns, that is. The Finns used to be actually more modern because they were more individualized. They were actually the first one to do a lot of these things, which we are first seeing now in Denmark in this election and the previous one. They have done so in Finland for a long time. In terms of money, Denmark is not very strongly regulated. There's something that you have to, if it's over a certain amount, about 5,000 euro, a little less, then you have to say, tell publicly who actually gave you that money. But that's about it. There's no kind of limit to how much you can get. And especially because the Facebook and the WhatsApp has kind of opened up this platform for just like, you can put as much money as you want into Facebook, and it's like there's no limit to it. And it's like, if you have 200,000 you don't know what to do with, just put it into Facebook ads. I mean, and that's what we are seeing. Commercials on TV, public radio is forbidden in Denmark, and that has actually kept the level down in terms of how much money you can spend. But this whole social media and micro-targeting has just opened up a venue where you can just throw money at it, and that's actually a huge challenge. The money needed in Danish campaign in the future will just increase drastically from now on if something is not done in terms of trying to regulate the output side in terms of what can you actually do. Yes.
Actually, a risk, an inequality risk coming up that we haven't had before in Denmark, but in Finland actually we have had it already before. But let's now move. You want to comment?
Yeah, I would have one comment to that because Kasper mentioned that micro targeting or social media in general, and I thought it was very interesting for a Finn to follow the Danish social media election campaigning, because Danish politicians even dare to use humor sometimes and irony, God forbid. There was this particular candidate called Alex Van Opslee from the Liberal Alliance, and he used this humor and irony in TikTok. And he became immensely popular, and especially among young people. And now, after the election, they even sold his campaign posters in DBA, which is like the Finnish-Tori.fi. So he became kind of like a rock star politician, at least briefly.
You don't see irony or humor in Finnish politics, I can say. It has to do something with irony is a very, very tough thing to use. If people don't understand it, then it might get really, really nasty. But if it's okay by you, I think we should now move on to the present situation in the negotiations for the new government, because it's really interesting. Already before the elections, we knew that Mette Frederiksen, and also maybe if it would have been Lars Løkke, what they wanted was a government that would be not red or blue, but going over the center, the political middle. And could you elaborate a little bit why this is?
I think, first of all, it's important to understand that blue and red in Danish politics is kind of the two blocks. I mean, that's the way voters navigate. They first look at, should I be blue or should I be red? And then they go for the parties within those blocks. The blocks are fundamental in terms of understanding Danish politics. It has been so previously in campaigns where journalists will ask, are you supporting the blue or are you supporting the red? And they're really kind of, that has been the defining things of how you navigate in politics. So Lars Løkke, as you know, in the campaign of 2019, came out with a book saying that he wanted a cooperation across the middle. And I think one of the things, you have seen several parties over the years trying to say this. The point is that the middle tends to be this black hole, just to kind of suck you in, because it means that you are very difficult for you to campaign on anything. You can always go somewhere else and get something more. You can, if you want more tax relief, you can go somewhere else. If you want something with economy and welfare, you can go somewhere else. You cannot be extreme on anything if you want to be in the middle. On the other hand, everybody wants to be in the middle because the middle defines whoever gets the majority. So it has been so that over the years, several parties has tried to place them there, and they also died. The Centrum Democrats has died, and we have a Christian parties who has tried to be in there, who haven't gone into parliament for many, many years. There's been several other attempts to be in that position. So when Lars Løkke came out with this as a major party going behind all his his deputies in his government at the time. I think it was very much as a reaction to that we saw that we had this hardline party which was running for in 19. We saw a strengthening of the populist right, and Lars Løkke was like, okay, now we have to kind of find the middle, the politics of reason, as he tried to put it. And that was in 19, and Mette Frederiksen was really clever here. So she went out and said, I also want a government across the middle. And she actually came out before Lars Løkke really had announced his candidacy in that sense. So Mette Frederiksen was actually, because she was able to do it first, she was also forcing the other parties, kind of the liberals and the conservatives and the Liberal Alliance, to say, well, we don't want a party across the middle. We want to point at ourselves. So Mette Frederiksen was able to place herself in the middle of things by when she called the election, said, I'm going on election on this broad campaign. In the Danish kind of public, being a consensus government, being a broad government, kind of including as many parties as possible, is very popular. So saying that is, on one hand, Danish politics don't want a bloc politics. They don't want efficiency. They want a broad government. But on the other hand, they also navigate in these two blocks. So it's kind of a in between things when you ask people, okay, of course you would prefer your own party had a majority. That's not going to happen. But then they are extremely pragmatic, and they'll say, okay, if I can't get the best, okay, I'll be happy to do whatever. And we have seen that over and over again, that Danish voters are extremely pragmatic. So, well, the bottom line is here, Mette Frederiksen ran on this. Lars Løkke was also running on a broad government, and the other parties, the Liberals, the Conservatives, was definitely not running on it. But the point is that she was able to play herself in the middle. So I think it was very much a tactical move. It wasn't, I mean, she tried to argue that we are in the middle of an energy crisis. We are in the war in Ukraine. She was trying to say that this is a different time. But I would say that the other element at least also played a huge role when she called for this idea of a broad government.
Yes, I actually, I wanted to ask Kasper one thing, especially about this broad government. Do you think that it has kind of paved way? They did this COVID deal that was across the parliament, or the defense deal last spring after the attack to Ukraine?
No. All politics in Denmark are done that way. I mean, usually I think it's something like 80% of all legislation going through Danish parliament is with the broad majority. So usually politics is done in a pragmatic way. So even though you have minority governments, one time as previous as a social democratic single party government minority, or previously where you had a kind of a multi-party minority government, you were forced into kind of negotiating every bill through parliament, and that actually meant that you will end up having these very, very huge majorities. And for Mette Frederiksen in her previous kind of period, she could go, if you wanted to do climate, she could go left. If she want economy, she could go right. If you want immigration, tough immigration, she could go right. So she was actually able to play this game going back and forth, and she's been very good at that. Now she's just saying that she wants to somehow more formalize that, I think. So I don't think that those two deals, the broad consensus for the deal with Ukraine, I mean, Danish foreign politics has always been a really, really broad majority. They always want to make, because we have minority governments, usually what the government is trying to do is to create the strongest majority behind, so policy doesn't change when the election comes. And I think actually, whether we're going to have a majority or minority government, or it will be across the middle or not, this time, it will not change politics very much. It will still be the same thing. They will still try to find broad majorities to make politics consensus oriented. That's the Danish way of doing things. This very strong idea that politics are better if it's negotiated.
But now, if we look at what's been going on during the weekend, we had especially the Liberals, Jakob Ellemann-Jensen. He got his party people didn't like very much the way he has been being pragmatic now during the last day, saying that, okay, what I said before, that's not the way it is anymore. I mean, first he said that he's not going to go into a government together with Mette Frederiksen, then that was forgotten, and now he's saying this thing about the impeachment process for the Minks, that okay, let's forget about that now. So it's maybe harder for the blue bloc, for Venstre, for the liberals, these negotiations than for Mette Frederiksen.
Yes, definitely. I mean, especially because, as you said, that the Liberals, Jakob Ellemann-Jensen, the leader, ran on a platform criticizing Mette Frederiksen. They needed this investigation on the Mink scandal. He was repeatedly go out saying, "I don't trust her," and he was repeatedly out saying, "I will never form a government." As you said, now there's not going to be an investigation. There seems to be negotiating a government coming through. And of course, think about all the people who have been running around the country, putting up election posters, running on a campaign, going out saying this, defending this in every kind of small community house across the country. And now they're being told, well, I want to be in government, so now I want to, all those things you ran on is just simply not true. It's a major election promise which has just gone up in the wind, and there's definitely a lot of anger in what we usually call the back country of the Liberals, like all the Ukul party soldiers, which has been fighting for this party in centuries. And we haven't really seen anything kind of, what is he getting out of this? Is he getting, one thing is definitely not probably being negotiated, is that some kind of tax cuts. So he's like paying, okay, no investigation for tax cut, or no investigation for less tax on the agriculture, which on climate, the CO2 tariff they have negotiating. So he definitely needs something, but it has to be very concrete. But even though he's definitely, there's a lot of anger in that party at the moment.
I mean, it's not so many days ago, actually, that still I saw some interviews made, I think it was in DR, that his party activists were really saying that, for God's sake, no, you cannot, this isn't possible, that he should get out of these negotiations immediately. So it's really what you were saying before, and you mentioned it to me before we started this discussion, that it's very important to underline that nothing really is clear at the moment. Everything is still possible. So that's, I'm sure that is correct. We have a question on the chat about the bloc politics. Does the clinging to bloc politics enforce extreme movements within the parties?
That's a really a clever question. So the bloc politics over the years has been kind of a way for voters to navigate. It has also been a way, so the blocs doesn't mean so much when we talk about how the parliament work, how they create legislation. They are always trying to make broad consensus, as I mentioned before. But when it comes to and it doesn't mean, and usually you don't run as a bloc. It's not like the red bloc or the blue bloc in terms of your campaign program. But it's true that if you have a situation where you basically, the blocs usually define a prime minister. So this time, Mette Frederiksen was the red bloc's prime minister, and Jakob Ellemann initially was the blue bloc, then the conservative was also a little bit, and then Lars Løkke in the end. So there's a lot of leaders in that bloc. But I think you might be right that if the bloc take too much attention, you cannot give room for the extreme views on the right or the left, for that matter, because you tend to kind of don't give room for the various differences. So we have 14 different parties running, but in the end, much of the attention was just on these prime minister candidates. So the blocs do tend to focus, make it more focused on the bloc's prime minister candidate, which can means that the the extreme points are being pushed out, and that being pushed out usually means that they are also gaining in terms of voters that are not satisfied with the status quo.
I would also like to comment in general about the blocks, because when you hear the blue and red block and you think it from the Finnish context, it sounds a lot more dramatic than it is actually, because in Finland the red is maybe more red and the blue is more blue, so the right-wing parties. So I hear quite often Finns commenting Danish Social Democrats that they are like the Finnish coalition party in many politics. So it's very, just like Kasper said, it's very fluid there in the middle, and that the politics doesn't change necessarily that much in all the issues, or even in major issues in the middle.
Well, I think it was in 1978 that Denmark last had a government that was formed over the middle, if I have read this correctly. But in Finland, we keep having these. I mean, the present government is one of these, and actually minority governments are very rare in Finland. So could you think of some lessons from Finland that could be useful for the Danish government if we get a government in Denmark that would be a government over the middle?
I don't know if there are lessons, but I just think that it's basically the same thing going on in Denmark. It is the government and the supporting parties, and in Finland the supporting parties are just in the government. So they just do that thing inside the government. But I think the lesson from Finland would definitely be because Danes are used to these minority governments, and I don't know how they would react if all the conflicts within the government would come to public like they do constantly in Finland. I don't know how you would see it. But for instance, in Finland, it was awful to follow that COVID-19 times, because the government conflicts were played in public, and that, of course, that was I think it was damaging for the communications about there's a big crisis, and it was sometimes very unclear what's going on. So I would say that keeping the arguments, maybe inside the government, this less open, but still, at least if there's a big crisis.
I don't know, but one lesson might also be that it's very important to find a common goal for a majority or minority across the middle, because they need to come to unite on something. And I think that could be, of course, the Ukraine thing. It could be the energy crisis. It could be fighting inflation. Could be kind of the general economic policies, which they usually agree on. But they have to somehow present that picture to the Danes and convince them that it is a crisis, because the election campaign was not very much focused on this crisis. It was focused on a lot of other things, but not really on that issue. So they need somehow to frame their government very forcefully in terms of the voters, that it has to be seen as exceptional times. And at the moment, of course, the energy prices is skyrocketing, and there's a lot of economic issues here. But I still think that they haven't done a very good job in trying to give that narrative yet. They have to find an enemy they can fight together. Otherwise, I think it will be difficult. Usually what they do in Denmark is they write what they call a platform for a government. So this will be a public document saying this is what we will work on, this is where we agree. And they all have to agree on that piece of paper. Sometimes that sheet of paper can be like 80 pages long, sometimes just 5-10. And I think we will probably need a longer document this time, because there's more interest to be mediated before. Otherwise, it could happen that it will just break up really, really quickly if they don't agree on these things. So, and that's also why the process of this negotiations has been going on forever. They're trying to write this document and finding out who should be in it or not. And I think there must still be a lot of hurdles along the way in terms of finishing that document. There's a lot of issues, which simply what will they work on together, and what kind of things will the Liberals have to give in? What will the Social Democrat have to give in? and then they have to sell it like they're not giving anything in, of course. But yeah, that's usually how it works.
We can actually see this very clearly in Finland at the moment, that what Annukka was mentioning, the crisis within the government. And at the moment when we have four months approximately to our next elections, actually we have so many crises within the government that it's really hard to see how they can work at all. And I think maybe it's only because of the crisis in Ukraine and the financial crisis that they keep themselves, and the NATO membership, of course, that they have decided that we won't let this go now, but we will try to continue until April. But I'd like to ask you a little bit about political decision making. Do you think that there will be a change in how decisions are taken, political decisions are taken in Denmark, if you get a government that is formed over the middle, compared to how it has been now?
I think that the most important thing is whether we're going to have a majority government rather than a minority government. If we will have a majority government, the government could basically decide within the government what they're going to do, right? And then they don't have to basically to include the others, or they can just kind of ask them, do you want to be part of this, and maybe some minor changes, but not really including them formally in the negotiation. Then all negotiations can be formed within the new government, and that could be the Social Democrats, it could be the Lars Løkke's moderates, and then the Liberals, Jakob Ellemann-Jensen's. They will be enough for a majority. If it end up being a minority government, being the Liberals and the Social Democrats with the Lars Løkke as a support party, then they will have to go out and negotiate each bill like we usually see in Denmark, and that will mean that we won't see much of a change. So basically, I think that the decisive part is not whether it's going to be across the middle, but whether it's going to be a minority or majority government.
That makes perfect sense. And which one, you don't want to guess, of course, so maybe I shouldn't ask you even. Do you think that there will be a majority government?
I think if you don't want to have the situation where you have to negotiate twice, first you have to agree with party across the middle, right? And then that can be difficult. And then you have to go out again and negotiate either to the red side or to the rest of the blue bloc. Then you will need the majority government. So I think they must be quite keen on creating some kind of foundation that is almost a majority government, either a majority government or a very, very close government where Lars Løkke basically have signed a sheet of paper saying, I will support the government all this. I will work with the government on all. He will be a steady parliamentary support for the government no matter what. So that I think those two are probably the most likely scenarios at the moment. And again, everything is up in the air still. But those two scenarios definitely on the table.
You were saying earlier here that we know very little about the negotiations, and we don't know exactly what kind of different things they might be promising each other there now. But what do you think could have been the most difficult questions for them in these negotiations now?
Well, I think the big hurdle was the mink thing, because the Liberal was running on a platform saying that they didn't trust Mette Frederiksen and they believed that she should be under investigation. So I think that was a major thing, as you mentioned earlier, that actually they went out this weekend and said, well, we're not going to have an investigation. So I think that was the first hurdle. The next big hurdle is how the farmers are going to be taxed through the CO2 tariff, like how many, like the cows and whatever put out in terms of CO2, how should that be taxed? I think that is difficult from a Liberal Party coming from a agricultural base to go out and support that, but I think that's one thing, and he will be paid off with some tax cuts because that's another issue. All parties basically have said they want to have tax cut. It somehow it's strange kind of situation. We have inflation, right? You usually don't do tax cut during inflation period. So it's a little bit kind of giving something to the voters and giving something back. And even though it's like a 0.5 percentage point, and it's going to be really expensive, right? So changing that is very, very difficult. I think then there's some other investigations that might be of interest. That our former spy chief is under investigation for saying something he shouldn't have said. So that's also something which is on the table. That will probably be an investigation. The blue want it, the red don't want it that much, but I think they'll be willing to have that investigation. Then there is something about how to, and that's actually the most difficult thing, is how to give money to the nurses, the health workers, all these jobs which are not paid on average. They need somehow to increase their salaries, and that is going to be very, very expensive in terms of putting more money into the healthcare sector. I think they need a big healthcare reform, and it's not just for the psychiatric the health part of it. It's the whole healthcare service which need fundamentally being changed, and that's a big thing, and that's something which will be. I mean, there's no easy solutions here, so that will be something they are definitely also negotiating. But I think we will see a big healthcare reform in the next few years.
And is a healthcare reform something that where the blue and the red bloc are standing on different sides, or is that something that it's a huge reform, but could they find a common way there?
I think they could find anyway. They could definitely find a common ground there, but it's one of the things is that should you close down the region, that level between the municipalities and the state, which are basically today only running the hospitals, should you close that level down, we actually elect people to these regions, these 5 regions. So you simply close those down and do something else, and that's one thing the moderate has been running on for a long time, where the liberals are not so keen and the social democrats are not so keen. A lot of people in these regions are social democrats and liberals, so they have some difficulties in closing those down. But I think that's one of the obstacles here. And then also, just because there's no easy solution, it's not. I mean, we are lacking 100,000 nurses, for instance, and it's like, okay, please come up with a good idea, and I think they're very open to that. I mean, there's really no easy way around these things. So some of these things are really difficult.
Kasper, I have to say to you that we just got the regions in Finland, and we have 17 instead of 5 because it was politically impossible to have fewer. So we are so much behind Denmark in this process with these healthcare reforms. And yeah, but we just had.
I'm not sure just having fewer regions is a good thing actually, but
no.
But it has been kind of the idea that we should be more effective. But on the other hand, controlling the hospitals is something the Danish Parliament would be very difficult for them to do, because it's actually. There's a lot of difficult decisions there. It's so much easier to have the regions do this, and then they can kind of say, well, we gave you all this money and you're not making it work, and it's just your fault. So there's kind of a little bit of a chicken game going on there.
In Finland, that's what we are. We are just exactly at that point here, where the new system should start working, and the government is saying that, well, we gave all this money to you out there, and now it seems that nothing is working the way, or it seems that it will not work the way it was supposed to work. In Finland, during this period that is now soon ending, climate has been a very hard thing for this government in the middle. So is this, you mentioned already the CO2 tax, that is a hard thing, but how about climate issues? Are these in what way are these going to be handled if you get a government that is not a bloc, either one or the other bloc?
In the election of 2019, we had a climate election. All the voters really wanted climate. It was on the top of the voters' agenda. In this election, the climate dropped down. Now it was suddenly healthcare and economy that was topping the list, and the climate came third, still high looking over the election years. But the point was that it has lost its conflict all the parties suddenly became climate parties, from far left to far right almost, had some kind of climate agenda. And it was like, we are all green. And it was so difficult for the voters to say, okay, where should I go if I wanted this particular trade-off between economic development and climate? Where should I go? They all seem to be kind of the same. And it meant that many of these big issues in the campaign was just like dropped out, never. So actually, I think even though climate was relatively high among voters' agenda, it simply didn't matter to them because they couldn't use it to choosing. They couldn't say, okay, I want to choose this party because of their climate politics. And that has been, if an issue loses its conflict, that somebody want more and someone less, it drops out of the focus of politicians. So I'm sure we will see some incremental change to the climate agenda issues, CO2 taxation, for instance, on the farmers, but it will be small things. I mean, we're not looking into a next period where we will see fundamental change on when it comes to climate. We will still try to reach those goals which was set in 2019. That is a reduction of 70% CO2 level, and that will still be very difficult to reach. They're still kind of saying we should wait for the technology, and it's like, yeah, that's of course a thing, but I don't think it will play a big role in the next election term.
I would, however, if I was a Finnish politician or expert, I would follow Denmark quite closely, precisely in that when they are negotiating the CO2 tax for the agriculture, because Danish agriculture is massive. So, and compared, for instance, it's a market-led, unlike the Finnish ones. So I think that would be super interesting to follow. And also there are some, even though the general level, I agree with Kasper, but there are interesting ideas popping up. Politicians are suggesting things. They are not in the mainstream yet, but there are interesting things going on. Like, for instance, this is from the local level in Copenhagen, and I don't think this is going to happen anytime soon, but they are suggesting, when they calculate if the city is carbon neutral, one politician has suggested, then you should also calculate with the citizens, their travels and everything they use. And then it, of course, gets really complicated, but that's how new ideas get born.
I think it's interesting what you said about the things that where there's no conflict, they don't get big, because from the outside, when you look at what questions were highlighted during the campaign, there was very little about security and defense. And when you come from Finland, security and defense are very high up on the agenda all the times. But for maybe in Denmark, this is the reason that actually there's no conflict in that.
Yeah, there's a big unity on that issue. Yeah, there's no debate.
But I must say, you're very right that there were no discussion. But I mean, we had these gas pipelines being blown up just off Bornholm, right? It's like 10 kilometers out on the sea, and it's like, wow. And we saw the pictures, and it's like we had some foreign ships sailing around, blowing up things, right? And we had like the drones at the oil rigs, both Danish and Norwegians, and all the Russian arrested in Norway. It's like, but again, it didn't really come up. It wasn't something. I mean, Danes weren't frightened, weren't taking this issue up. Well, we need to invest more. They were still kind of negotiating. Well, we have these 18 billion they have decided to spend, getting closer to NATO's 2% of the GDP. But so it was off the agenda. Not even this. I mean, I was actually a bit surprised that we did see a few days around the gas leaks and the explosion that definitely that issue increased when asking the voters. But it was like the next week it was just forgotten, and that was a bit. Of course, some of it has to do that it wasn't something new coming up. It wasn't a good media story. Basically, there was no conflict. There was no kind of the gas line stopped. We didn't know who did it, and nobody would actually dare to say who pointed at somebody, and so it just kind of went out, and that was a bit surprise. We have seen before that NATO issues in the 80s could play a role in Danish elections, but otherwise foreign politics and defense issues never plays roles in Danish politics. Danish politics is extremely domestic, really extreme domestic, which is sometimes a surprise for when foreigners look at Denmark.
I would like to actually continue briefly to that, because I have the exact same feeling that it's domestic, and the Danish political rhetoric, it's a very open about values and making choices, whereas Finnish politics is very often about the only option we have, and everything is handled through some kind of crisis or threat of a crisis. So Danes are a lot more open just for this, that this is how we think, this is what we do. But in Finland, you always have to say that if you don't do this, we are all going to die, or there's going to be this and that catastrophe. So yes, it's a very different approach.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Maybe it has to do with the pragmatism that you were talking about earlier. Maybe Danes are more pragmatic, just as a rule, and then you don't need to be always focusing on catastrophes.
But also, of course, our history, we have so many dramatic transitions, and yes,
definitely.
We are almost running out of time, but there's one more thing that actually a couple of more things, many more things. But I think that the fact that we have financially very, very challenging times now, that goes for both Denmark and Finland and for the rest of Europe actually also. How does this now affect, do you think, the negotiations for the government?
I think we are still waiting for this narrative, as I spoke to about before. I'm still kind of waiting for Mette Frederiksen and Jakob Ellemann to come out united and say we will, and then really talk about all these, the energy crisis, the inflation, rents, interest rates are going up tremendously, which is going to affect the housing market tremendously in Denmark. People are looking into paying 10,000 euros more a year for gas and interest rates alone. There's definitely a lot of people who have to sell their houses. We are looking into a recession, basically. But they need to come out with a good plan, right? But also talking to this agenda, and they haven't done so yet. And I think we will need that in the next weeks before we see this government, in order to accept this government across the middle. So it is like this united government across the middle, because we are in a very different time. But we need to see that narrative more clearly.
Denmark also has quite a bit of space for these negotiations, because it's the only EU country, in addition to Luxembourg, that has a public government surplus at the moment. And also their debt ratios are one of the lowest in Europe. So the public economy is in quite a good condition compared with the others.
That is true, and that's also one of the things why economy was such a difficult issue, because on the one hand, the economy is going really well. We have full employment. We have very large surplus in terms of exporting to other countries. The inflation is higher than we have seen in 40 years. That's a big problem. The interest rates, of course, coming up. But we still have, you're right, we still have the surplus. And that has also been why usually you will see an incumbent government actually lose when they have a bad economy. But they had a bad economy on an inflation interest rate, but they had a good economy when it came to the surplus and a lot of other things. So the Liberals and the Conservatives never attacked Mette Frederiksen on her handling of the economy. They didn't blame her. And I think they probably were right, because I guess it wasn't her fault that the inflation rate are going up and the interest rates going up. That's kind of international trends, but usually you will see them attacking on this. So you're right, they could spend more money, but they also have a lot of things. They want to have tax cut, and they want to spend more money on the healthcare. So yes. I think that kind of money can easily be used very quickly. So it's not the. I think they will still try to. I don't think they will open up kind of the chest and just expend lots of money. You wouldn't see that, no.
Yes. Yeah, I mentioned it because it's a very Denmark is in a very different place compared with Finland now that the Finnish parties go to the election campaigning, and we have deficit, and there's a very worrying trend with the aging people and government finances. So I can see these tones are very different in now in these two countries when politicians talk about the situation.
And that's a little bit a sad thing to finish with, but our time is up now. I want to thank you very much for all the interesting things that you have said and for giving us this 1 hour of your time. Thank you, and I wish you actually a very Merry Christmas coming up here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.
Thank you. You too.